Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Mock, and I am honored to be the president of JSpaceCanada and to welcome you this evening on behalf of the board of JSpaceCanada to an evening of thoughtful discussion. We refuse to be enemies. JSpaceCanada, as most of you know, is described as the Canadian home and the Canadian voice for progressive Jewish values and Israeli-Palestinian peace. We really want to thank our community partners who helped us promote this evening: the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims, Holy Blossom Temple's Interfaith Committee, Solel Congregation, the Intercultural Dialogue Institute, the Enhancing Social Justice Education Project through OISI, the Rosanna Project, the Canadian Friends of Rosanna, the Faith of Life organization under Imam Slimi, and Heart to Heart. All of those organizations are indeed partners in wanting to promote peace in the Middle East, peace between Israel and Palestine, and also social justice in Canada. We actually planned this several months ago. Some organizations, because of the escalation in the conflict and violence and how sad we all are by that violence and the loss of innocent lives in Gaza and Israel, some have said that they're canceling these kinds of events. We had our joint vigils last week and marched together for peace. And we felt now that of course we would go forward with this. For now, it's more important than ever for people of goodwill who truly want peace to get together and to continue to build the relationships and trust necessary for the courageous conversation. Feelings are mixed. I just want to share a few of the messages I've received in the last few days that many of you may have also received. A letter, for example, from the president of York University that urged open, productive, and respectful dialogue or debate in physical or virtual spaces. With the rise in anti-Semitic incidents in Canada, a concerned parent in Ottawa wrote, "I feel the pressure in the Jewish community to support only the pro-Israel camp and not to be divided around the support of Israel. But then nuance would be lost." And she goes further to say, "My key message is that if one group is unsafe in Canada, we are all unsafe." A few years ago, it was Muslims being murdered in their place of worship, she writes. Tomorrow, it can be another group, God forbid. Spreading hatred in Canada in the name of a conflict is not okay. Another person with whom I have very thoughtful dialogue, and sometimes we really don't agree on these things, shared a powerful statement in the article that he sent me, and one that struck home for him. And I quote, "It's not that attacks on Jews in the West are unfortunate and unintended consequence of the persistent demonization of Israel, but rather the demonization of the Jewish state is undertaken so as to re-legitimize attacks on Jews in the West." End quote. The Jew haters could not attack us for our day-to-day conduct as citizens, he writes. But in terms of the Jewish homeland, they are having a field day, in large part because of misinformation and lies. But here's the key phrase, but also based on some core truths. And the last one I'm going to cite is from Barbara Landau, a JSpace board member who chairs our Shared Society Committee and is also co-chair of the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims. And she shared an article by David Enoch. I'll just cite a couple of sentences. It's entitled, "We Still Believe." Even when the earth shakes beneath our feet, especially then, we look directly at the painful reality and affirm our commitment to peace, equality, ending the occupation, and personal friendship and political partnership between Jews and Palestinian Arabs in Israel proper and on both sides of the Green Line. Enormous harm to innocent civilians in the Gaza Strip or in Israel is never justifiable. Even facing such hard circumstances, we remain clear-eyed. The circumstances we find ourselves in are the result of politics, of racist, violent, special interest-driven politics. We will not give in to such politics. We refuse to regroup along national or religious lines and be each other's enemies. Which, of course, is a natural segue into my introduction of Shahid Akhtar, co-chair with Barbara of the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims. 1 30-second reminder, the chat is just for the panelists to talk to each other and keep the time. The Q&A, we encourage you to use the Q&A, is where Shahid and I will be monitoring the questions, and we will have time for Q&A after our wonderful guests have their opportunity to have the dialogue. But first, Shahid Akhtar, whom I have known for, I think, almost 30 years now, Shahid,
yes,
is an alternative dispute resolution practitioner and president of Conciliators Without Borders. He has written a book entitled The 7 C's Compass for Conflict Resolution, a practical guide for real ADR. Having practiced international corporate law, he has worked as a journalist, a TV host, a mediator, a facilitator, and coordinator of harassment prevention and conflict resolution programs. He's trained more than 10,000 professionals, managers, staff, lawyers, judges, community stakeholders, and so on, in models of workplace prevention of harassment and discrimination, resolving conflicts, conducting mediation, and developing cultural sensitivity in the workplace. In fact, I think we first met when I did some sessions for the Community and Social Services Ministry, of which Shahid was a longtime employee. Since co-founding the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims 25 years ago, wow. And I hope that soon we'll be able to launch the book he's now working on, The Reluctant Cousins, Jewish-Muslim Relations in the 21st Century, Imagining the Possibilities. Since the last 25 years of CAJM, Shahid has done a tremendous amount to prove that Jews and Muslims should not and will not be enemies. Shahid, my friend, over to you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for this very generous and kind introduction. I hope I can live up to it. I wish, Karen, we were meeting under better circumstances, because right now there is so much sadness, heartbreak, and even anger in Muslim, Jewish, Arab, Palestinian, Israelis, that you wonder if dialogue like this are really going to be productive, but that is precisely the time when people like Walter and Sabiha, organizations like JSpace and CAJM, they should come together and say that no, we will not give in to hatred, bigotry, and violence, and we will not be enemies. Thank you for choosing that beautiful title, Sabiha and Walter, for your book. Just briefly about the association. It was in the same spirit that when things are tough, then we should get going and bringing people together. That a quarter century ago, Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims was created. It was the time after Second Intifada. It was the time, and every Israeli and Jew and most people remember when Yitzhak Rabin was murdered by a right-wing extremist who knew that the same right-wing extremism a quarter century later will come back as Trumpism and become acceptable and ignite new hatred and new bigotry and new violence, which perhaps we are seeing today. So like now, at that time as well, the impact of what was happening there was felt here as well. Immediately, instantly, and intensely. And we wondered, me and a colleague, friend of mine who was from Israel, we talked about it and thought, is there anything we can do? And we wanted to join an organization which was bilaterally, as Muslims and Jews could work, because we realized, at least my limitation, and Sabiha today comes from the same background, that although Palestinians and Arabs, their hurt and their anger was totally understandable. Nobody could say that, yes, we know what they're going through, because it couldn't be the same. But the intensity of emotion in the Muslim world, for people who were not Palestinians or Arab, the emotional commitment to the third most holy land was no less. So we tried to look for an organization. We couldn't find one because those were the days before Google, if you can believe that the world existed before Google, but it did. And we did the second best thing, created our own. And Karen, and I want to tell our audience today that Karen was instrumental from the very start in bringing under one roof people as varied as the Palestine House coming to Bnei B'rith. 3 men, 3 women, 3 Jews, 3 Muslims came together in the first ever. It was not a webinar at that time. Nobody had heard that word, a seminar together. And then the foundation of this organization was laid. We began meeting. People would come to our meetings. They would go to their own communities and start similar associations, to a point that now there are hundreds of them in Canada, United States, Europe, Middle East, even Africa and Asia. So then came 9/11, and we found that Muslims suddenly had become synonyms with terrorists. It was at that time when we were feeling so vulnerable that I got a call from, of all the people, Barbara Landau, who said that they feel our pain, and who said that they wanted to bring Jewish individuals and organizations to march with us saying that, no, we are not terrorists. We also want the same thing that you want. We want peace. We want tranquility. We want to work with you to create harmony and cooperation with each other. Then in 2008, I had the pleasure of meeting Walter. He came to a meeting where I remember, Karen, you were presenting a workshop, and Walter also made a presentation, and it was, I won't say the word, but it was admiration on first sight. Because if I say love at first sight, people may think different thoughts. So I admired in Walter that he had a very analytical mind. He observed what was going on. But what I admired most was that for me, and I must confess here, I do get emotional on times. And I sometimes say things which come from the bottom of my heart, but sometimes people think that may be too strong. And what I admired in Walter most was that for me, he was actually Mr. Cool. He would never, ever raise his voice. He would deal with any difficult situation in a very calm manner. And I can give you an example here. I'm sure that I cannot see the audience, but I'm sure that Imam Salimi is among our audience today because he's also sponsoring today's workshop. He had hosted a dialogue between I and Walter. And in that dialogue, truths were spoken, and some people did not like what was said, and they became almost aggressive and verbally pretty well got into verbal assault. I was so surprised to see Walter charming them. In no time, they were eating from his hand. And talking about eating, it just so happened that that day, Imam Salimi had served a great dinner, and I did not know then, but all of that was cooked by Imam Salimi himself. He's a great cook. So people, Jewish Muslim interaction groups, I want to tell you this, that sometimes food can be the greatest antidote to frayed nerves and at the same time to emotional hurt. That's when we had our latka and samosa diplomacy. You have heard about ping pong diplomacy, but through food, people can really come together. And through Walter, CAGM engaged in twinning. We would take congregations from mosques to synagogue, from synagogues to mosque. People open their hearts, their minds, their homes, and it continued for a while and still continues in different ways, because the overarching message that we have is that we promise to do whatever God has gifted us with, whatever capacity and capability, to do whatever we can to bring Jews and Muslims together. And lastly, I want to just briefly introduce Sabiha Rahman, who, like me, although she's an American, but she's also a fellow Pakistani. She is by profession a healer. She is an ideal person to conduct interfaith work because of her background, her involvement for decades in this kind of work. And she brings a mother's sensibility and a healer's skills to interfaith dialogue. This evening is for Walter and Sabiha. And Walter, The microphone is yours.
Well, Shahid, thanks so much, and Karen also. I mean, everything Shahid said now is very touching to me, and overly generous for sure. Karen, I thought your statement was really beautiful. We had also prepared a short opening statement, so I'll try to do it even shorter because you said most of it.
Well, we're going to leave. We're going to leave you now, and we will come back later for the Q&A.
Very good. Thank you so much, both of you. I mean, I was very touched. So, I also want to just start very briefly from where we are right now, at the moment, and which is to say that, like many others, many other North American Muslims and Jews, Sabiha and I have been devastated and traumatized by the events of the past week in Israel-Palestine, and together we appeal for an end to the violence there and for a just solution to the conflict, guaranteeing peace, security, and true self-determination for every Palestinian and Israeli. But equally as important, as both Karen and Shahid said, we pledge as Jews, Muslims, and allies that we will not allow the conflict in Palestine and Israel to tear apart the alliance we have built here in North America, in Canada, and in the United States. We are brothers and sisters who love and respect each other and are committed to standing up for each other if either community is under attack, whether that comes from the outside or at moments like this from within our respective communities. Sabiha is someone who has been just flooding Facebook and her blog with imprecations against the rise of anti-Semitism we've seen in recent days, and that's just a perfect example of this thing that we have to stand up for each other. And we're going to we vow to redouble our efforts to fight Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, all forms of bigotry, including the growing white supremacist ideology that is a deadly threat to both our communities. We need each other. So Sabiha, can you start us off?
Thank you, Walter. Good evening, and thank you, Karen and Shahid, for your continued commitment to keeping our communities together. I was born and raised in Pakistan. I had never met a Jewish person. Pakistan has not recognized Israel, and Pakistan is pro-Palestinian. So I had always viewed Jews through that lens. In fact, my father's passport was stamped, all countries of the world except Israel. That is literally and figuratively where I came from when I came to the United States in 1971. How about you, Walter?
Well, I had never met a Muslim until I was well into my 20s. I grew up as a lonely Jewish child in a mainly Gentile suburb of Pittsburgh. And then I read the book Exodus when I was 10 years old. I fell in love with Israel, or the idea of Israel. And then literally a few months after I read Exodus, like a good fairy interceding, my father came home from work one day and said, we're moving to Israel for a year, that he was going to have a sabbatical year at the Weizmann Institute of Science. He was a physicist. We went there. I spent my 6th grade year in Israel. I just fell totally passionately in love with the place. I felt fully connected to my true self as a Jew. And yet I had no interactions at that time with Palestinians, either Christians or Muslims. And then my family came back, but against my own wishes, I wanted to stay, but I said I vowed I would return to live there as soon as I could. Sabiha?
The first time I met a Jewish person was when I came to the United States. My husband was a resident physician. It was a Christmas party, and he took me there and introduced me to his colleagues. Half of the residents were Pakistani Indian, and the other half were Jewish. And his Jewish colleagues were being very welcoming to me. We hope you're not lonely. Call us if you need anything. How can we help? I had difficulty reconciling my negative perception of the Jewish people with my positive interaction and the reality on the ground. Very soon I realized that my upstairs neighbor, who had taken me under her wing and shown me the ropes, was Jewish. My husband's boss, who mentored him, Jewish. When I got pregnant, my obstetrician, Jewish. When I had a baby, the pediatrician, Jewish. And then I ended up buying a house in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood. I had no idea what I was getting into. I liked the house, I bought the house. My father, who was visiting from Pakistan, and he would see through the windows on Saturdays, the families walking down to the temple, said to me, people of faith, no matter what their faith, make good neighbors. These families will be good for your children because they will raise their children well with good values and a disciplined way of life. Well, my father was not only right, but I got a bonus out of it. I no longer had to explain to my children why I don't have a Christmas tree or why we don't eat pork. Walter, tell us about your first encounter.
Well, I went back to live in Israel as a young adult at the age of 26, and I stayed for 3 years. And those were some of the happiest years of my life. I became a journalist, and I was working for the Jerusalem Post in Haifa, living in Haifa, working there and covering the north of Israel. And that's when I had my first encounters with Palestinian citizens of Israel, both Muslim and Christian. Those were incredibly important for me, eye-opening, I should say. It did show me something that I hadn't understood before, that there was a kind of systematic discrimination against the Palestinian citizens of Israel, or Israeli Arabs as they were then exclusively called. And that was eye-opening, but what was more revealing and maybe more important ultimately for me was that I was received in those visits with such warmth by the folks there. And they were basically saying to me, we're so moved that you came out here to connect with us, to hear our side of the story, and please stay for dinner. And we had, amazing encounters, talked half the night. But when I would go back to Haifa, I would often hear from my Jewish friends, they would kind of roll their eyes when I would talk about this, and they would kind of say, Walter, you are a naive American. You're a nice guy, but you really don't understand what's going on here. You don't understand the depth of the conflict, and you don't understand the Arabs. We do. And of course, I had to take that seriously. I did take it seriously because I knew I was a newbie and there was a lot I didn't understand. But what I found out when I asked them if they had been to those same villages, they basically said no, or maybe I drove through once, even though they were only 10 kilometers away from where they lived. And so I knew many more Arabs than my Israeli Jewish friends who had lived there all their lives. So what that taught me was really the transformative power of personal encounters, why that's so incredibly necessary to go and meet people face to face and go from seeing them as a sinister other to a human being like yourself. So that really transformed my whole life. Sabiha?
So what transformed my whole life was the conversations that were taking place by the sidewalk. I was a homemaker raising 2 boys. I'd be standing on my front lawn watching the children, hanging out with my neighbors, and we started talking. And I guess that's where grassroots activism came from. I must have invited my neighbor over for dinner. She would have said, the conversation would have gotten to dietary restrictions. And now we were saying, oh, so you don't eat pork either. Okay, so halal and kosher, same thing. She may have invited me over for coffee. I would have said, I'm sorry, it's Ramadan. What is that? And that's how our interfaith dialogue began. Totally unplanned, totally from the bottom up. At some point, I realized that I would like my Jewish friends to meet my Muslim Pakistani friends, because I did not want my Jewish friends to believe that perhaps I was unique and that I was not like the rest of the Muslims. And at the same time, I wanted my Muslim friends to see how wonderful these Jewish families are. So we started gathering in my home, and eventually that grew into dialogue in public spaces. Walter, your approach was more top-down, right?
Yeah, it was top-down. It was sort of as a journalist, because I came back to the States and I worked for about 20 years mostly in New York as the New York correspondent for the Jerusalem Post and other newspapers working at the UN. I covered the peace process for that whole period, and I believed in it deeply, and I felt very privileged to be covering it. And then, as you all know, it crashed and burned in a terrible way in the early 2000s. I felt personally bereft and kind of drifted into Muslim-Jewish coalition building in the United States as an alternative path to peace and reconciliation. And then another good fairy interceded several years later in 2007 and 8 in the form of Rabbi Mark Schneier, the president of the Foundation for Ethnic Understanding, who'd been a little bit involved in my work and suddenly said, you know, we want to take on Muslim-Jewish relations in the foundation. And Walter, can you come aboard as the Muslim-Jewish program director? I said, sure. I jumped at it. And then once I was there, it took us a while to figure out what that would involve or what, you know, how I could do it. Effectively, what I became is a shadchan, the Yiddish word shadchan, which means matchmaker. My job was to go out to all kinds of cities across the US and Canada and later Europe and try to build connections between rabbis and imams. And for the purpose, as Shahid said, of twinning, of holding events together or trying to get as many cities as possible to hold events together, Jewish Muslim events, and multiply that across the continent and build build an alliance. Obviously, I really want to say right here that one of the very best cities we had was Toronto. Just wonderful twinnings here together with the support of the CAGM and later with JSpace and others. And anyway, can't say enough wonderful things about Shahid, Barbara, and Karen and the work they did and I did with them. It was very inspiring. But anyway, to make a long story short, as I often would be, traveling, sometimes flying on planes to different twinning events around North America and later in Europe, I would be sitting with somebody on the plane. You know, you'd speak to your neighbor on the plane, and they would ask me what I do for a living, and I would say, well, I twin Jews and Muslims. And first they would give me this look of utter incredulity, and then when they saw I was serious, quite a few of them said, "Oh my God, that must be the worst job in the world." And I told them with absolute conviction, this is the best job in the world. I feel so incredibly privileged to be able to do this work and to help to bring folks together and to see them connect and from these two communities to learn about each other, to find out how similar they are and the similarities in the two faith traditions and watch this thing grow. And I'm telling you, this is really like holy work, is what I said at the time. And I still feel that. So anyway, that was what I was doing. And around 2009 and 10, I met Sabiha. I called Daisy Khan, who some of you may know at the Society for Muslim Advancement, American Society for Muslim Advancement. And Sabiha, who worked closely with Daisy, picked up the phone, and we got friendly. We started talking, but we really had no idea at that point where this would lead us.
So where it led us is that in 2016, my memoir, Threading My Prayer Rug, was being published, and I realized that it would be nice if I could get a blurb by a rabbi, Walter. Now, Walter is not a rabbi, but he worked for one. So I wrote to him. I was in Pakistan at the time. I sent him an email saying, Walter, I have this book coming out, and would Rabbi Schneier be willing to write a blurb? Walter wrote back and said, I have to read the book first. I emailed him the manuscript, and this nice Jewish gentleman spent his day of rest on Saturday going through the manuscript, writes back to me and says, Sabeeha, the rabbi will be happy to do a blurb, and I have an idea. Why don't the two of us write a book together? Walter, how come you came up with that idea?
Two reasons. One, you're a wonderful writer, and it's a great book, Threading My Prayer Rug. Secondly, I had been looking for a Muslim co-author who was a good writer for some time to do a book together with me about this movement that we all, had been involved with, that I've been involved with, and I wanted to get the word out that it was happening. The Jews and Muslims were coming together across North America, and not enough people knew about it. So that was why I wanted to write the book. But then by the time Sabiha and I kind of were getting started, we saw that a very ominous development, things were going in a very ominous direction, 2016 and 17. And there was this upsurge in bigotry and hatred and authoritarianism. And I just said, I felt this should be also a manifesto, our book, that is the two largest religious minority communities in America, Muslims and Jews, need to stand together in support of democracy, human rights, and religious freedom. All of those basic core values which make Muslim and Jewish life viable in America, in Canada, and everywhere else. So that was how we got started. Then when we sat down, we came up, we talked together, and we realized there were kind of four core principles that were at the heart of our book, of our cooperation and the larger movement. The first is the principle of, if you save one life, it is as though you saved the world. Obviously, I think almost every Jew knows that that's in the Talmud. Almost every Muslim knows that's in the Quran, but very few Jews know it's in the Quran, and very few Muslims know that it's in the Talmud. I had no idea myself until I was covering an event in 2007 as a journalist, a Muslim event honoring a young man who had a young Muslim immigrant in his early 20s who had saved some Jews on the New York subway who were being accosted, who were being beaten by skinheads, and he jumped into the fray, saved him. He was being honored. And so I'm at this event, and the Muslim event, and the speaker says, as it says in the Quran, and Hassan Askari's action exemplifies that. And that was eye-opening to me. And it showed me that at the heart of Islam, like Judaism, there's a commitment to mercy, compassion, justice, and the preciousness of every single life. Sabiha, do you want to tell us about the second principle?
Second principle is welcome the stranger. Both the Quran and the Torah have passages about the importance of welcoming the stranger. My mother was a refugee. When India was partitioned in 1947 into India and Pakistan, she made a perilous train trip across from India to Pakistan. On the way, the trains were attacked. Thousands of people were massacred. She made it safely in the new land where she was welcomed. There she lived, there she died. And until her last day, she believed that if there was one place on God's earth that was made for her, it was Pakistan. Fast forwarding to 2016, the elections have taken place, and now we are feeling that our very existence is at threat. At that time, we get a call, my husband gets a call from the rabbi of our neighborhood synagogue saying, we stand by you in solidarity, and I would like to accompany you to a mosque. My husband took him for Friday prayers, and just as he was entering, he said, should I remove my kippah? No, keep it on. He walked in, stood shoulder to shoulder with the Muslims in congregation as they said their prayers, looking very much a Jewish person. And when the prayers were over, people lined up to come and shake his hand and say, thank you. One man walked up and said, I wish I could give you a gift, but the only thing I have on me, and he held up his prayer beads. This is a family heirloom, he said, which is very precious for me, and I would like you to have it. And these were moments where I recalled Martin Luther King's words that only in darkness do you see the stars. Walter, your mother was a refugee as well.
My mother was a refugee from Nazi Germany, who at the age of 14, she was born in Berlin, and at the age of 14, she fled with her own mother on foot across the Belgian border and barely made it out and suffered all kinds of issues with what we call today coyotes and others extorting money from them. And so they crossed into Belgium, but it took another almost 3 years to get to the States because of the quota system that had been placed on Jewish refugees at that time, basically preventing Jews from getting into the States. And as we know, so many hundreds of thousands died unnecessarily because of that anti-Semitism at that time, who might have gotten here. My mother finally did get there after running through Spain, France, Spain, and Portugal, because they got on a boat. They had Ecuadorian visas, but when they arrived in New York City, the boat went to New York City. They were supposed to continue to Ecuador, but the organization HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, took my grandmother into the city, found someone who with the same last name who agreed to sign an affidavit. And so that made it possible for them to stay. The key thing is, while that was happening, my mother, who was then 16 or 17, was held on Ellis Island as surety, to make sure that my grandmother would come back. I remember, by the way, Karen and I think Shahid were with me that one day when I came to New York, and I told that story. So my mother then spent a long life in America, loved America deeply, but was involved in movements like civil rights and the anti-Vietnam War movement because she wanted to make the country she loved the best it could possibly be. And I had the privilege in 2018. I was invited to speak about my mother's story in front of the Supreme Court because the Supreme Court was about to rule on the Muslim ban, the obscene Muslim ban that existed. And I told how so much of what my mother and so many other Jews endured in the 40s was now being visited on Muslim refugees and other refugees by our own government, by the United States of America, and how horrible that was. And I said, what really infuriates me is when you hear this term that being used by the President of the United States and others, like the illegals, as though there were some kind of lowlifes or subhumans. And I said, well, my mother, when she arrived at Ellis Island, was an illegal also, and she ended up staying and making huge contributions to this country. So welcoming the stranger is certainly at the core of our book. The third value, very briefly, is Isla and Tikkun Olam. Isla is the Arabic word for reform, and Tikkun Olam in Hebrew is repairing the world. To me, both of these values, although they're not exactly the same, but they're pretty much overlapping, and they both convey the common moral imperative in both faiths to help those who are in society who are most in need. And so a big part of the twinnings that I was involved with organizing and taking part in many cities were about social action, Muslims and Jews together, feeding the hungry, visiting the sick and elderly, holding health fairs where doctors from both communities would minister to, serve people who didn't have health insurance, and many other things. And that was such an important value. And there were so many moments when we would be standing in a homeless shelter, Muslims and Jews together with our aprons on, giving food to hungry and homeless people. And that somehow felt incredibly, incredibly powerful, and still does. Sabiha?
So the fourth principle that unites us is standing up for each other. Never was it more apparent to me until the then President Trump issued the Muslim ban. On a cold February morning on a Sunday, my husband and I walked into Times Square at a rally that had been organized by Walter's organization, Foundation for Ethnic Understanding. And I was surrounded by people holding up posters that read, "Today I am a Muslim too," except that they were not Muslims. They had come to stand in solidarity for their fellow Muslims. And as I walked through the crowd, I noticed a woman in a wheelchair. She must have been in her 90s, could barely lift her head up. And I thought about what it took for her to get there, into her woolies, into a wheelchair, a cab ride, getting out there. And there she sat, protesting loudly by her silent presence. This was a Sunday. People could have been anywhere on their day off, but they chose to come and stand in solidarity with their fellow Muslims. And then not long later, the tables were reversed, and now it was time for the Muslims to stand up for their fellow Jews. Tell us about it, Walter.
Well, on October 27th, 2018, as many of you know, there was this horrific terrorist attack by a white supremacist neo-Nazi on the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, which was my hometown. Very briefly, I was traumatized, as I'm sure so many of you were, by this, and feeling just unsafe as a Jew in America at that moment. And to see, and then watching CNN and watching the Pittsburgh Jewish community leaders, the Pittsburgh Muslim community leaders come over to the Tree of Life and stand in solidarity. It was very, very powerful to see over the next couple of days, $200,000 was raised by Muslims across the country. And finally, Muslims came out at so many events that were held in synagogues the following Shabbat. All of that was just immensely powerful. And so that whole thing sort of made me understand this alliance is working. We've been here for each other on both sides, and we can continue to do that. Sabiha?
Yes, so it hasn't always been easy. We have had our share of challenges. One of the challenges that I face is that I do find it difficult to recruit and engage Muslims in interfaith dialogue. It could be that we are still a young community in terms of where we have evolved. It could be that this is the immigrant trajectory, but it also could be that we have a lot of work to do to build trust. Walter, what are some of the challenges you have faced?
I've seen both Muslims and Jews pull back from this at certain moments, and one of them obviously is around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially, and we saw in past past years when there were eruptions of violence in Gaza and between Israel and Gaza, that there was a pulling back by rabbis and imams, Muslims and Jewish leaders who had been already connected and working together. They just were uncomfortable going forward at that point. They were uncomfortable having the difficult conversation. The lesson to me really was you have to pick up the phone, and call each other. But I'm really, really happy that we've seen in the last go around in this last horrible situation in the last few weeks, we've seen much more picking up the phone, joint statements by groups like the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom and many other Muslim Jewish groups around North America, and leaders reaching out to each other saying, we can't let this pull us apart. So that is encouraging. Sabiha, do you want to finish up with the lessons we've learned and we just did about all of this?
So very briefly, and we can talk about this in detail in our discussion, but we would like to share with you 8 lessons that we have learned. And number 1 is that we live in North America. And it is important that if we are to preserve pluralism and democracy, that we communities stand and stick together. Number 2, speak out and stay engaged together on issues against injustice across the world and here. Number 3, we should support the work of NGOs in Israel-Palestine that are working to improve lives over there. Number 4, we should allow others to speak out even if we do not agree with them. Number 5, let's not allow the Israel-Palestine issue to be weaponized by the politicians. Number 6, let's not denigrate or demonize people on either side. 7, Muslims should engage with mainstream Jews who are Zionists rather than allying themselves exclusively with groups that are of the same ideological bent, and the same for the Jewish community. And finally, let's be cautious about labeling one another as anti-Semitic or Islamophobic. With that, we conclude the formal part of our presentation, and thank you for listening.
And Shahid and Karen, come back.
Thank you. And I'm sure Karen is also back by now. Karen?
Yes, I hope you can hear us both.
Yes,
we do.
Do you want to summarize some of the questions that have been asked?
Sure. Shahid and I have been monitoring the questions and the chat, and there's a great deal of interest. You've really hit some wonderful nerves, we can say. I think it's fair that I give the first question that came in was from Barbara, and also from some of our other board members that are kind of related. And Barbara writes, today there are such tensions and anti-normalization pressures, and you described some of those. And as a matter of fact, we found in the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims that the Arab and Palestinian Muslims were not coming to religious interfaith dialogue, which is why we had to start other side groups like Together in Hope, the Women's Arab Jewish Dialogue, or the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue. But your comments really resonate. So she asks, what are some helpful hints to overcome the actual obstacles that people are facing? And David, who is also on our board, David Grosskind, and it's related, what can we do here about the tensions in the Middle East between Jews and Muslims spilling over into Canada?
Walter, you want to talk about Project Rosanna?
Sure. Well, yeah, a number of things I'll say very quickly, which are that we just, I think it's so important for, groups like CHAM and JSpace and groups, the interfaith groups, the Sisterhood, Salam Shalom that I mentioned, and different groups, New Ground in LA and the New York Muslim Jewish Solidarity Committee that Sabiha is part of. All of them have really been speaking out together in this situation in the last 2 weeks, which is very, very important. And it wasn't happening as much before. So I think that says something about the ties that have been built over this 15 years or so, really, and the challenges we face together, especially in this country, in the United States, with Trumpism, with, the Muslim ban, the rise of the things we talked about, Pittsburgh, and now, the continuation of the threat to, the values, the democracy that we need. Another thing, though, I would say is that I think, instead of kind of avoiding talking about Israel-Palestine, which some of us and many of us have tended to do for a long time, and saying, oh, well, let's not deal with that because we got to strengthen Muslim-Jewish ties in Toronto or New York or wherever we are, that, as they say in Hebrew, let's go the other way. Let's make Israel-Palestine part of what we do together. So I've been involved with a group called Project Rosanna, which many of you know, and I think we probably have some members from Project Rosanna Canada who are on this broadcast. And basically what Project Rosanna does is it's a NGO, an international NGO that helps to bring us, among other things, sick Palestinian children with cancer, in need of kidney dialysis in Palestine, and get them to hospitals in Israel. That's one of many things it does. It trains Palestinian doctors also to raise the level of the hospitals in the West Bank. And so that is, we could get together behind that group, or there's many, many others, humanitarian NGOs, and help to make that work, help to save lives over there together, whether we agree fully on the political solution, because we don't, but I think we can together, Muslims, Jews, and Christians, make a difference over there. And I think that would strengthen us over here. So I think that's one thought. Instead of, pushing the thing under the rug, let's deal with it, but let's deal with it in a way that we can deal with it together and make things better.
And I would add and say that clearly the Israeli-Palestinian solution is not in our hands, but what is up to us is to keep our communities together here in Canada and in the United States. And a lot of ground has been covered in building those relationships through interfaith dialogue, but we have also strengthened that trust by working on projects that are important to us here in our homeland, by getting involved, whether it is serving meals on Christmas Day to the homeless in the church, or whether it is planting roses in the garden and cleaning up the park. When we get involved in issues that are important to us, whether we are Jews or Muslims, but that help strengthen the United States, if we work on those projects together, those boundaries disappear, and that strengthens our relationships. So work on a project together.
Thank you. Shahid, do you have a question to pose?
There are actually some other questions as well coming from our viewers, and one of them will perhaps give chance to Sabiha and Walter to plug in their book as well, because one of the questions was the audience: how is your book and approach to refusing to be enemies being accepted now that people have seen so much death and destruction? And I think along with that also, another question was, how do you think the Trumpism in the United States has impacted the whole situation?
So I'll try and answer the first part of it, which is that because of what is happening now in the Middle East, the message of the book, and of course the book itself, has gained a lot of interest and a lot of traction. Because let's face it, we are tired. We are we are worn out. We are burnt out over this issue, and everyone is looking for whatever relief and solution they can find. So we don't want to be enemies. And as a consequence, the number of calls and requests that Walter and I have had to engage in book talks, we are literally booked every evening, to the extent that I lose track of who is the host today and who is the host yesterday. I made that mistake yesterday by thanking the wrong person. But that has been the impact of it. We would not have had the same level of interest had things on the ground been otherwise. Walter, you want to take the next one?
Well, I would say, about Shahid's question about Trumpism, I think it has greatly strengthened the alliance that has been built. I mean, by a magnitude of many, and we see that. So I think that experience, and knowing that it's still out there, it's that threat is still out there, and really a dire threat to both communities. To have a kind of America, God forbid, in America where they're an anti-democratic America based on some kind of ethnic Christian, whatever you want to call it, fundamentalist Christianity is really a dire threat to both of our communities. So you've seen some of the organizations, the larger organizations, which weren't necessarily involved in the early days when Karen and Shahid, we were getting involved. Some of them were holding back and saying, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm thinking of some of the Jewish organizations in the States, like the ADL and the American Jewish Committee, have really come on board in recent years, and with the Islamic Society of North America and other groups. So that's all to the good. But so that's all to the good. But times like this right now are pretty scary, and obviously we do see people who, right now, as Karen said in her opening statement, who are pulling back and saying, well, what good is all of this when people are dying, when bombs are falling on Gaza, when rockets are flying at Israel? And as Karen said, these are not easy questions and there's no easy answers. But we feel very, very much that as much as we desperately want to make our contribution to healing things over there, our main priority really needs to be on our own societies and preventing that hatred and fear from coming over here. That's what got me into this 20 years ago, and I feel it even more strongly today.
And building on that, could you also say a few words about how is the culture shift taking place? Because this is the first time that in Congress, people have openly demanded equal treatment, equal human rights for both Palestinians and Israel, particularly Bernie Sanders and his group. How is that impacting the political culture in the United States?
Well, I mean, I would say that that in the Jewish community, which I know pretty well, I think that there has been the support for Israel is still there, but there is a strong feeling, I think, that and I hope that will also be happening more in Israel among Israeli Jews, but an understanding that the status quo does not work. I mean, I think that there was an illusion that was built up that the Netanyahu was some kind of wizard, and he made the rendered the Palestinians impotent, and he had relations with the UAE, and he was all over the map, and that piece has been pretty much exploded. What comes next is a big question, but I think that that kind of acceptance. Okay, well, we'll accept the occupation because we got a pretty good life here now. And anyway, I think that. But actually, you're asking more, Shahid, about what's going on in America. But I think that a lot of that feeling has really crept into the Jewish community and the other communities as well, and the sort of the pro-Israel community, maybe I should say.
Thank you. Karen?
Walter and Sabiha, we're really pleased that we have a multi-faith audience, and there's a couple of questions here that need a little bit of clarification, and then I'm going to pose a question. There was a comment made, I think during the conversation, somebody points out that, Walter, you mentioned Christianity as a threat. to both of our communities. And someone also asked, are there any Christian and Muslim friendly association, people doing Muslim-Christian dialogue? And related to a little bit of that, because I think it's an overriding question, and it was posed by Gabriella Gallagher, the head of Peace Now in Canada, one of our other partners in all of this work. What, in the interfaith way and in the Muslim-Jewish way, what is being done to engage youth? So if you could just comment first on the multi-faith, the Christian issues, and then how are we working to engage youth in this kind of work?
So I'll take on the Christian piece because I apparently what I said was I'm very, very sorry, first of all, if I made it sound like I'm somehow in any way, casting aspersions on Christianity. What I meant was, obviously, when I made that comment, was that the kind of Christian fundamentalist ideology, some of the evangelical manifestations, which have slipped into white racism also, that's what's scary to us. And the kind of now, as far as relations, I mean, this is something I want to say, which is that we work totally, Sabiha and I and many others work on both the Muslim-Jewish, in just Muslim-Jewish, and then in the larger interfaith framework, including Christians. And we think both are very, very important and certainly not contradictory. We focused a good piece of our energy on Muslim-Jewish work because we think that especially because of the Israel-Palestine conflict, our communities were cast or saw each other as adversaries. And so we have so much work to do, had and still have so much work to do in that field. But we absolutely need to be part of the larger interfaith community effort, also to stand up for the very same values of pluralism and democracy. So many Christians are been involved and supportive of our work. And also, especially in this piece I just mentioned now about helping the organizations in Israel-Palestine, the NGOs and the humanitarian groups, absolutely should be, I think, in my opinion, tripartite. If we have Christian allies, and we've already had some wonderful ones in the support of Project Rosanna. So that would be my answer.
And I will add to that by saying that before getting onto this call, I was on a 2-hour call for the program called Scriptural Reasoning, where the 3 Abrahamic faiths gather and pick out passages from the 3 scriptures around a certain theme. Just one example of understanding what our holy books are saying. Then we have the Daughters of Abraham, which has chapters all over the United States, and I believe they may be in Canada as well. But about the second question, which was about the youth groups, there is an organization here called the Sisterhood of Salam Shalom. I believe they have a chapter in Canada as well. It started off as a Muslim and Christian women's group and now has expanded to have a teen group where the teenagers in high school as well as in college have their own track of bringing the faith communities together. Another example has been forums. For example, the Rumi Forum hosted us, which was spearheaded by college students. And the topic there was facing bigotry from within and from without, where Walter and I were asked to share our experiences, but then they were in breakout rooms coming up with action plan. Okay, we understand what's going on, but now what are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. Walter and I have been invited to speak at universities. We just spoke at 2. We have 2 more coming up to the classes about engagement between the faith communities. And then, of course, there's a lot going on the campuses, mm-hmm. A lot of interfaith dialogue. The Islamic Center at New York University is a big example of interfaith dialogue that is flourishing on the campuses. A lot's being done, and I pin my hopes on this generation.
Great. I think I would make it my last question, at least, Karen, and that is, one among the audience has asked, have you had a chance to actually get into dialogue with fundamental Muslims and Jews who have extreme views and who don't see eye to eye with you? Maybe it's for both of you.
Sure, sure. Well, I feel like I've been having that dialogue, my whole career, even preceding this, certainly with quote unquote fundamentalist Jews so that's in my own community, and that's that's a process that continues, and I on some levels there's a lot of beauty in power in that sense of unconditional acceptance of every Jew, Kol Yehudim, Zeh L'Zeh, and that's all powerful, but it's not okay if it's like exclusivist, in my mind, exclusivist only for Jews, and then somehow everybody outside is somehow a danger. So that those kind of and so that's out there. We and in many of our dialogues we get questions that obviously are coming from that perspective or from a more fundamentalist Muslim perspective, and we just answer as respectfully as we can. We like to continue the dialogue, and we will. I think continues to be a challenge, but I don't think the main thing again is our focus is just not letting any of that, and not letting this tendency of allowing the Israel-Palestine conflict to be weaponized by people who would use it to tear apart our communities. That's a big priority for us. Sabiha, did you want to?
Yeah, speaking for myself, that is a challenge for sure. I personally have not had direct one-on-one dialogue with, as you would, fundamentalists, or you could say, the right-wing Muslim community. But at an organizational level, Muslim organizations in the US have been having these conversations. I have not been part of that, so I cannot speak from direct experience.
Okay, Karen?
Well, we I think addressed most of the questions by combining them.
Yeah.
There are some other questions that ask for very practical guidelines on how do you handle the more fundamental in both our communities, or not only is there division between our communities, but within our communities and the challenges of that. Someone else asks, well, what about how we end up just talking amongst ourselves and not, in other words, preaching to the converted and reaching out and branching out? I must admit, I'm just going to be shameless and say, well, I think I would encourage all of you to click on where it said you could purchase the book and see that Sabiha and Walter have provided some very practical guidelines on how to. We refuse to be enemies, and all of us refuse to be enemies. We know that when there was the horrific murders in the mosque in Quebec, that it was Rabbi Splansky from Holy Blossom who reached out to other rabbis and other synagogues, and they created the Circles of Peace and the next Juma prayers in Toronto and in Mississauga. And then after the Tree of Life, Imam Slimi and Imam Hai Patel and other leaders in the Muslim community made the rings of peace around synagogues on Shabbat. We refuse to be enemies. And we lay the groundwork for relationship building, the way so many of the organizations in Israel that bring the groups together, the hand-in-hand schools, the heart-to-heart programs, the children teaching children, the Givat Haviva, and many other partners. And here in education, the importance of helping our social justice educators and people who teach anti-racism not to omit anti-Semitism and Islamophobia from their agenda. And not because they think that it's critical race theory, and so they're only going to use Islamophobia, so they eliminate anti-Semitism from the discussion. No, it needs to be recognized in all of its forms and not conflated with legitimate criticism of obnoxious policies of government leaders on both sides. But it's not that we say there's good people on both sides in a Trumpian sort of way. It's that we call out hatred, we call out anti-Semitism, we call out Islamophobia, and together we are stronger. Shahid and the Canadian Association of Jews and Muslims, thank you very much for being you. It's the joint statements that make a difference. Organizations come and go in their clout or in their organizational structure, but at the core of it, there have been some lifelong friendships made through grassroots getting to know your neighbor. Rabbi Joachim Prince said in the Martin Luther King marches that neighbor is not a geographic concept, it's a moral concept. And we are neighbors and we refuse to be enemies. Thank you to our other partners, the Intercultural Dialogue Institute, Holy Blossom Temple, Interfaith Committee, the Rosanna Project in Canada, the Enhancing Social Justice Education Project, Solel Congregation, Faith of Life Organization, and Heart to Heart. Sabiha, Walter, on behalf of all of our partners and certainly on behalf of the board of JSpaceCanada, thank you so much. Godspeed. Inshallah, we'll be together again, and more strength to you all. Shalom, salam, and all the best.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
Karen.
very much.